Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to the Foundation's live online events, live from COWS, headquarters of the MacArthur Foundation. I'm Joss, I'm your host today, and I look after the international institutions and government engagement here at the Foundation, and today we're going to talk about circular economy in its international dimension. And I'm sure a lot of you are busy actually looking through the European Circular Economy Action Plan that's just been released this morning. So bear with us, take a pause on this, and let's explore the dimensions of trade and international relations when it comes to scaling up the circular economy. I have the pleasure of being joined today by Marianne Kettunen, who's the head of Global Challenges and Sustainable Development Goals programs at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Hello, Marianne. You're live from London with us.
Hello, good morning, Joss. Great to be here with you this morning, even though virtually I couldn't make it to the island.
We'll make that happen another time, and thanks for taking the time. Marianne, just to dive right in, you've been looking at the Circular Economy Action Plan, as everybody has, who has an interest for these questions this morning because it's just been released. There is an international dimension that wasn't there in the previous one. What is it the sign of, in your opinion? Is it because we're reaching that point where scaling up the circular economy can only be done if we consider the international context? Is that how you read it?
I think, yes, that's certainly part of it. But I think part of it as well is that since the first Circular Economy Action Plan was published by the EU and the EU players have realized, what it actually means to become circular within the EU. So it will automatically have needs coming from the global side. So basically we will have global needs, but we will also have global implications. And I think what wasn't quite as clear as it is now is those global implications come through the China's trade ban on waste, building on EU's unsustainable waste exports. I think that realization has basically happened since the Circular Economy Action Plan 1.0 and now the new one. So yes, to answer your question, it's basically we understand better our role in the world now, both in terms of what we need, but also in terms of what we can do for the world, both in good and bad.
Yes, and you guys have taken the lead on exploring those questions through a report that I have here, which is available online, which is about the EU circular economy and trade, improving policy coherence for sustainable development. And the IEEP has been at the forefront of these questions. You've been the lead author of that document with the support of the Finnish Foreign Affairs Ministry. We've had the pleasure of sitting on the advisory committee for it, and it was very enlightening. Conversation is really young because circular economy only popped up on the World Trade Organization's radar in 2018 for their public forum in Geneva. And now it seems like it's gaining traction. We were together at a big OECD workshop a couple of weeks ago in Paris. And basically to explore a bit those questions, could you talk us through, first of all, why the IEP had decided to create a report, and what were the first conclusions, what surprises, tell us a bit what you discovered in the process.
Precisely. Happy to. So the reason why we as IEP decided to work on this particular topic was because we saw that EU was full on going circular, which is absolutely brilliant. But nobody had really thought of explicitly what it would mean to the world. So the starting point for EU's Circular Economy Action Plan in the past was very much also to make sure that EU would be self-sufficient, with and kind of being able to be self-sufficient and more secure with its resource use and less reliant on the world. And building on that, obviously, nobody had really perhaps thought as thoroughly as should have what implications that will then mean to the world, thinking about what would happen if EU then decides to really go through its implementing its renewable, so its circular economy objectives as it happened. So that was the premise for it. Nobody had thought of it as we saw. It wasn't in discussions as much as it should have been. So we decided to take up the challenge, and partnering up with great partners like yourselves, like UNCTAD, TIA Foundation, who've already, and OECD, who already have been looking at this topic as well. And the key thing we discovered was that there indeed was a need for better policy coherence. And it wasn't only that there would need to be more policy coherence between how EU's internal circular economy policies would interplay with trade, but also how then that would link to EU's development policy, and how that would link to development world and the implications in the developing world and the development paths they have perhaps foreseen to be taken in the future. So put that in a nutshell, the sustainability promise that circular economy brings us is that there will be less extraction and use of primary raw materials, and there will be more use of secondary raw materials. And obviously that shift, if it happens, will have impacts on trade and trade flows, and that will also have then impacts on the development pathways that a number of developing countries have perhaps thought to take up for themselves, many of which are still building on the extraction of primary resources and mining and such.
And
so yeah, that kind of haven't been really thought through.
And so for these countries, that could be a worrying trend, actually, if they see it as potentially hampering their own development because it's predicated on the extraction of virgin material. So what sort of signals can be sent? And I suppose that the EU acknowledging the international dimension is a good signal for these. It's not to say we're going to shut down and rely on what we have now in the system. There's a partnership dimension that we need to put in place as well to engage those countries in the global transition.
Precisely, and that is the point that we are very much trying to emphasize. So moving away from that, dialogue, which is very much, we want to be self-sufficient in the EU. That's the way to go. Moving on to the dialogue as to we understand how this will impact the world, and we are willing to go through with this true partnership, also understanding that EU therefore has the responsibility to support through its development and development cooperation, the trade partner countries in the developing world to shift to circular economy within the country, but also that way helping them to take up the opportunities that there will be for them engaging in circular economy as well, which certainly there will be.
And does leapfrogging play a part in this by looking at avoiding linear lock-ins in extractive heavy investment or incineration? How can we take the lessons learned from European and Western economies in order to make sure that those mistakes, if we want to call them that, or learning points can be avoided, and thus gaining a bit of time as well? Is that
Ideally,
something
yes,
that can be done?
In principle, yes. Of course, then the question becomes as to how will that dialogue be held between the EU and trade partner countries in the developing world, so it doesn't look like EU telling them what to do, which is always very much the old-fashioned and wrong kind of way to go into the dialogue. But I think perhaps what we've been noticing in the circular economy debate is that at least a number of, for example, countries in Africa are interested in circular economy and have this kind of more thinking mentality building on their use of recycled material and secondary raw material, that they would be perhaps keen to make the shift. So therefore, there's grounds for the partnership, which would be building on almost sort of an equal dialogue where both partners have something to learn from one another. And that's, I think, is also been highlighted in this conversation or discussion, that it's not only that the EU can perhaps show some examples what to do or what not to do for the developing world, but also other way around. So actually, developing world can remind the EU that things can be done in this way, and there is, for example, a lot of entrepreneurship that is taking place in many African countries, for example, which the EU could learn from, at least in terms of attitude, I guess.
Yes, and external signals as well have been very important. You alluded to the Chinese ban on import of waste plastics, for instance, which typically was outside of the EU, telling the EU it's not okay to carry on doing this. Actually, you've considered that you could throw your stuff away. We're the away and we're fighting back. And that was the biggest challenge to linearity, wasn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. And of course, ideally, in the trade world, putting up trade bans is not considered the most brutal way to go about it. It's absolutely understandable what happened and why China did what it did, and also other countries might follow. But hopefully, in the future, now that we've known how it can play out in the most negative way, we will not end up, with a kind of trade wars on circular economy, or or circularity in that respect, but we'll actually end up in cooperation, in dialogue, using the trade and negotiation and trade agreements as a means for dialogue, basically, now that we go forward.
And so in that case, we could consider that the free trade agreements should include a dimension on circular economy, some requirements, whether that's product standards or other provisions. Is that something
Yes.
that should be integrated into not only the environmental chapter of these FTAs, because in a way that would confine them to a dimension where they would not have enough impact, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the key conclusions, going back to our report again, that what we discovered and what we also want to promote and highlight is that at the moment, the EU trade agreements themselves and the trade negotiation route seems like an underutilized route to promote circularity discussions and uptake circularity globally. So that could certainly be enhanced. What we discovered was that in the existing EU trade agreements, there were only 2 that actually mentioned circular economy. That's not entirely surprising, given how it's relatively new, to use the term circular economy. A number of the other agreements, they talk about resource efficiency, which is an equally enough, good starting point, I think, to build on, build discussions and build something on linking to circular economy and trade context. But then looking into the future, what was interesting to see was that the EU sustainability impact assessments, which are done to support EU trade negotiations. Ones for Philippines and Indonesia, they actually look at circular economy explicitly. And as you said, they look at circular economy in the context of a number of specific sectors. So really bringing the circular economy out from being a safeguard for the environment and therefore included in the sustainability chapters of the trade agreement, bringing them into the sector considerations as an underpinning clause, as an underpinning starting point for the sector-specific trade, that would be the way to go. So, for example, in those sustainability impact assessments, they looked at textile sector, and there was electronics looked at as well. So that basically trade on those sectors ideally should be building on circularity principles and circularity standards, and so forth.
And do you have a visibility with regards to how the experts and the judges from the World Trade Organizations are trying to get smarter on this topic? Because they acknowledge that it's very new to them, and it's great to see that they're involved in the conversation. But what's their way, and what are they trying to learn and understand, if you have
If you can, yeah.
visibility on that?
Maybe not a very comprehensive answer. I think what I've seen, however, is what we've seen that in the World Trade Organization context, there is first and foremost been a greater uptake of the sustainability aspect of trade. So basically backing up a little bit, you're not looking at circular economy, but looking at the sustainability aspect. So there seems to be a great increase in that, and also increase in terms of how trade agreements and partners of the WTO are looking at increasing sustainability. And I think within that broader trend, there is also that creates opportunities and interest for circular economy, particularly, I think, as well. WTO often, the experts, I know they say that they are there to facilitate dialogue between its members, rather than perhaps to take the leading role as WTO. So I think that's how they see themselves. So therefore, building on that thought, what happens in the context of WTO will be determined by the interest of the members of WTO to this particular topic. So that brings it kind of back to the EU as well, saying, well, what EU will be doing in the future vis-a-vis circular economy and linking that to trade, that will hopefully trickle back to WTO and in those discussions, and then allow also experts within that context to be more supportive of perhaps also pushing forward that agenda. And not only EU, but also EU partner countries, which I think brings us to also thinking of globally who else works on these topics or is interested in this topic beyond EU.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes at the same time pretty tricky and super interesting, because if you go into the granular details of what circular economy means in terms of implementation, we know that, for instance, on the material side, which has an impact on GHG emissions and climate mitigation, remanufacturing is a massive potential lever for circular economy at scale. Yet, in certain countries, the import of remanufactured product is banned. So that's one very key critical barrier to the implementation. And that's something that your report focused on as well, right?
Yeah, so our report highlighted the importance of standards. That's basically where you're going. So basically similar standards and definitions so that, we wouldn't have what they call accidental trade barriers for good type of circularity. So making sure that there is a possible flow of secondary raw material from country to another. And in order to allow that, we will basically need to know what's in the product, how the product has been perhaps produced. And I think kind of linking the debate, obviously now the whole EU opening of product passports is quite interesting, because that would allow more transparency in terms of what's been traded with as secondary raw materials or as recyclable raw materials or as products, and therefore allow better use of these products globally. So not them ending up being waste in a country B when they leave country A, but actually, if not circling back to country A, then being used in the country B in a way that allows them to be taken up back in the economy, either in a country B or then exported secondary raw materials to country A. And that's kind of what we're talking about. And that's why the standards for products and the transparency of what's in the product are very, very important.
So that's also a question when it comes to data availability, transparency, embedded product information, product passport, if we want to call it that. Do you see that as a key component of the equation as well? And if we don't have the right data and the right mechanisms to harmonize data, then we're fighting a losing battle on that front.
I would say so. That's basically where it's one of the key levers to enable this. It's a very complex one. So therefore, I think we are all now looking with excitement as to how the EU attempts in upcoming 1 or 2 years will pan out, and it will take time, I'd imagine, because it's not going to be happening with the snap of our fingers. But without that, I don't quite see how we'll be making the shift. And what's positive, however, is that if EU decides to go full speed ahead in this, as it now seems to, building on what we see in the new circular economy strategy, then there is a good chance that at least part of the world will follow, and that will also allow sort of when we're pushing towards a shift on a more global scale. But that requires a dialogue with countries. So, for example, one could have a dialogue in the context of an EU-Canada trade agreement to look at how EU and Canada can cooperate through trade to elevate standards for circularity within traded products. Or similarly, of course, looking at more developing world, EU could cooperate with the developing partner trade countries to support them in their internal shift to circularity, and also helping them to match the EU criteria to be able to enter the EU market. And there are certainly mechanisms to do that as well. So basically what I'm saying, yes, I think it's a key lever, but it really needs proper focus on several fronts to be able to happen.
Interestingly, you mentioned Canada. Canada is going to host the World Circular Economy Forum in October, so that could be a key question for a side event if the organizers are listening to us.
Listening, yeah. I think the organizers are listening, and they have been listening. So we do foresee that there will be something around trade in that forum. So fingers crossed for that.
So that's great, and that opens up the discussion on the more challenging topic of multilateralism and international dialogue is facing headwinds at the moment. Is that also likely to impede on the progress of circular economy at scale if the idea is more to focus on national markets and have an isolationist point of view, which in a way paradoxically fits the circular model as well? So there's that tension between, do we go for local nodes of circular economy that form as an aggregate the global circular economy, or do we need to globalize it completely?
Yeah. And again, our report and our work, doesn't take a stance in terms of where to close the loop, whether it should be, global or whether it should be local. I see opportunities in both, and I think there will be opportunities in both, and I think realistically there will be some loops will be closed on a global scene. So just to touch upon that particular thought, but in terms of the challenges to multilateralism, obviously I think they will play into this circular economy debate as well. That's also why I see that the role of EU could be really important in terms of making a shift also globally, because at the moment I don't really see that there would be global champions or global championing arenas like the G7 or G20, for example, that would be taking the circular economy more broadly beyond plastics necessarily forward, or the WTO for that matter, in the trade context. So therefore, where the ball then falls onto is the corner of blocs like the EU, who have a market power to shift, how the markets work and what the demand is, and through that change also how the world works more broadly. So because of the whole challenge of multilateralism, I feel that it becomes even a bit more of a EU's business as the leader now to really hold on to this promise to shift to circularity and do it in a globally aware manner.
And talking about the market power, China and the EU signed a memorandum of understanding on circular economy in July 18. There hasn't been a lot of follow-up to that yet, but do you think that's one of the key good signs that something is happening? Because in terms of market power, if you add China and the EU, who in their right mind would produce something that doesn't fit on either of those markets? In a way, if they join forces, circular economy happens globally overnight, doesn't it?
Yeah, in principle, and I'm not sure about the overnight, but pretty soon I would imagine, because you have two big trading blocks, and no matter what America would be doing in that context, might not matter anymore. So yes, in principle that holds a promise, but like you, I haven't really seen anything really concrete coming out of it, and I guess therefore the key question now is how much effort will EU put into this, using that memorandum of understanding more explicitly. I haven't picked up any explicit initiatives, and also I can't see anything explicit vis-a-vis China having gone quickly through now the published circular economy action plan. It really talks about partnerships, and it talks about having dialogues, but you're not necessarily explicitly of China, at least not beyond, might be in the annexes somewhere. But so basically we'll have to see what happens next, and I don't quite know how big of an emphasis EU is planning to take to push this, particularly with China. It is in the EU Africa strategy, however, so that came out a couple of days ago on Monday, I think, and the EU Africa strategy and partnership does foresee that there will be cooperation, particularly also around circular and blue economy. So that's been announced, and that will go forward. But China, we'll see. But I'm also therefore also interested to hear from you that whether you see that whether you have found any movement in that front between EU and China in terms of dialogue and increasing dialogue looking into the future, which I might have not picked up.
Well, to answer that briefly, I think the EU-China dialogue is quite active, and we took part in a session last October on plastic specifically, because the NDRC is looking to legislate on that, and it seems like there's a good alignment when it comes to the strategies, but more on that a bit later. I think the point about Africa is an interesting one, and it partly answers a question that we had from Michelle, who's asking if the EU New Deal, Green Deal, will have an impact on trade or not. So we've partly answered that, but maybe something that you could go back to is the actual weight of the EU on the trading scene, because it's one of the biggest and the most active authorities on the global scale,
global
isn't it?
scene. Yeah, absolutely. So EU is often cited as the most frequently negotiating trading bloc. So it has over 80 existing trade agreements, different kinds, and over 40 in negotiation. So that brings us to over 120 existing and future trade agreements between EU and the world. So that is quite a lot. So definitely, most active in the world. Also, because EU has a large purchasing power, with that it holds a promise as to what EU then wishes to purchase. So, for example, if EU now through the new Circular Economy Action Plan is saying that we will be amping up our sustainability criteria for products entering the EU market, that will make a difference because EU is such a big market for all sorts of products as well. And then looking at EU vis-a-vis the developing world, the statistics also show that the EU trade plays particularly important role with the least developed countries and developing countries in general. So in terms of therefore EU's role in supporting sustainable development through trade, compared to other blocks, for example, America, EU has seemed to be having the biggest role through some preferential agreements, for example. So that can also, be an important factor for the future for these countries to then be able to use that trade agreement and trade route with EU to continue to support their development, and perhaps indeed continue to support that in a more circular manner, if that's is of interest to the both parties.
Yeah, and of course there is a dimension which we haven't touched on explicitly, and it's probably a very tricky question to answer, but at least we can acknowledge the importance of looking at the bio side of the economy as well. It's not only about heavy machinery and remanufactured photocopiers that get traded. A lot of it is what people call soft commodities. And in a year where biodiversity is one of the key elements on the international agenda, do you see a role as well for circular economy advancing that specific question?
Absolutely, there should be a role. There should be a role for circular economy in advancing the sustainability in the agriculture, fisheries, basically the green sectors. And where we are at the moment is that the debate on circular bioeconomy has been kind of missing in the debate of circular economy. And certainly in the circular economy and trade context. So we haven't really looked into that as a community to the level of detail that we could and should. And I think that's some of the things that we certainly at IEP will be looking into now going to this year and in the future. What is happening at the moment is that the EU Circular Economy Action Plan does now make more concrete links to the green side of the world. So it makes a link to the farm to fork strategy. It makes links to the circularity and its importance to environment, the green environment. So I had a specific element there, which is about water and nutrients and soil, I think, was the third element. And that is great because it basically brings the green environment more into this circular economy policy package, which perhaps hasn't been there before. But the current circular economy action plans, looking at it very briefly through, it doesn't really extend this thinking through the trade context into the world. So it doesn't really give us any guidance as of yet as to what should EU's trade do in this context. So should it, for example, therefore endeavor to support sustainably circularly produced produce, for example, from other countries like Africa? But that's kind of what we would be talking about. And in principle, obviously, that could be the case. So we could then look at in the future using trade routes, trade agreements to explicitly support circularly sustainably produced products within the green markets like forestry or agriculture as well. And I guess that's basically where Ellen MacArthur Foundation also fits in, because you guys have discussed and explored what would circularity mean in the bio world, and what would be sustainably circularly produced product through using those kind of standards. And that's basically what we should then revert to as our guiding point or guiding standards.
I think it's important in the discussion in the year where the IUCN summit is going to take place as well, to make sure that the circular economy is relevant when it comes to climate action and when it comes to biodiversity as well. And because the third principle of the circular economy is about building natural capital and creating value that way. I'm moving on to another question, which is quite interesting, even though it will be difficult to answer. I think it's good to have it on the radar, though. It's Giles asking us if it is conceivable that American policies on climate could make it less relevant from an international trade perspective versus China, Africa, and other blocs.
Yeah, I don't know quite how that, so thinking top of my head, how that would play out. Any thoughts from your side?
No, I guess it feeds on the point that the multilateral process is facing headwinds, and we know that there's a tendency from certain markets, such as the US, of course, to focus on the domestic side of things. So I guess that's where the question goes towards. But yeah, it really is difficult to, and maybe actually that's something that you guys can explore in the follow-up to that report, because I'm sure you haven't finished working on it, have you?
No, we haven't finished working on it, and certainly the plans. So what our report did, it sketched the kind of sketched the scene, which seemed to have been helpful because it also brought together around the same table, at least virtually, but also in our launch event, practically the different relevant EU DGs. So you had environment responsible for circular economy, but also trade and also development cooperation. So we kind of, highlighted that these different players need to be having a dialogue, and we need to consider all these different policy areas. But then where to go next is in more concrete terms, is what we want to be exploring next. And in that context, we are planning to cooperate in the future together with the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, which I'm sure people know who work on circular economy, they know them as well. And certainly cooperating with MacArthur Foundation, with OECD, with the players already mentioned before, to kind of see what happens next. And in that context, we are hoping to look at explicitly relationship between the EU and a number of partner countries. We are looking at perhaps specifically countries where EU has a trade agreement with, like Canada, but obviously, United States is a big actor, and depending on where they're going to be going next, it can be either an ally or perhaps even a hindrance indeed, in terms of what kind of opportunities there are globally for circularity. So jury is still out in terms of which partnerships we will be looking at specifically in the future between the EU and the world. But United States is always an interesting element, or interesting partner / ally / not ally to look at.
And when it comes to the UN process, do you think that something on circular economy explicitly being addressed at the UN General Assembly in September would be something to work towards, or is that in flow anyway, and it's mostly driven by countries? Do you think it needs that sort of international recognition?
That's a good question, and I haven't really thought of that. And maybe that's something we will now be, we both will be putting into our thinking caps and see, whether that would actually merit the effort. Top of my head, and I think that highlighting the importance of circularity and global circularity and the opportunities and risks on a global level would be merited. I don't think it would hurt, but whether that is then whether that's then the element, and that either makes it or breaks it, I don't think so. I think whether it does or does not feature on the high-level political forum this July, I think circular economy can and will go forward. But of course, highlighting it in that context might give it further impetus, and therefore it might be helpful. But I'm not sure, whether that is the case, and I can't even actually remember whether SDG 12 whether it was actually now looked at in that context.
It was.
So it was. So how about you then? What do you think, and what Ellen MacArthur Foundation thinks? Should we really focus trying to have something in a high-level political forum or not? Or UNEA, for that matter, further than it's been now, on plastics.
I guess what struck me is the fact that the resolution on sustainable consumption and production that was adopted at UNEA 4 gets a lot of mention. And so it struck people that circular economy is acknowledged there for the first time. So obviously it has an impact. So I agree with you. It probably isn't a make or break proposition, but if we can help putting it out there and making sure that it gets adopted, it gives countries also a mandate to think about it, because it's been officially adopted, and they can go back to their constituents and say, we do that because it's legitimate to talk about circular economy. Look, the UN says it is. So in certain cases it can help, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us, to thinking about also, what happens with the climate COP next time. And of course, now it's going to be still on in Glasgow, unless something drastic has happened. And we've been certainly thinking that, it would be really interesting to have something in Glasgow linking circular economy more explicitly as a solution towards, low carbon future, and linking that also to trade. But I'm also wondering, what your feel is as to using the climate arena more forcefully in the future to bring the agenda forward and also make sure that the interlinkages between the circular economy agenda and the climate agenda really go forward hand in hand. And that's kind of my question and thought to you as well. That's kind of what we've been thinking and playing with.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. It absolutely is a fundamental piece of the puzzle. We released a piece called Completing the Picture in September, showing that 45% of global GHG emissions are directly linked to the way we produce and we use stuff that's in the economy, whether that's our appliances, cars, but also the food. So we can't crack the climate crisis unless we look at the material side of the economy. We're very clear on that. And the question on putting it central stage at COP26 is very much at the forefront of our preoccupations.
Yeah. That's good. I think, hopefully then that sounds something like we could also cooperate, come the upcoming months. But we agree it's really, really important.
Watch this space. I'm sure we can do a lot of things together. Just a very final question to close the session, Marianne. When can we expect the follow-up to your report on circular economy and trade to be published?
Well, we are now sort of planning the work, and we're looking at maybe a couple of years horizon together with the Finnish Innovation Fund, and we haven't really planned planned the road yet. So whether we will be having a report in about a year's time and then continuing to build on that. So something along those lines. But I think the answer here is watch this space. We will be, as soon as we know and as soon as we have actually fixed plan ready, we'll be getting in touch and letting people know. And the whole point of the report we made that you showed was to bring together community. And I think maybe that's a nice note to end things with as well. It's all about bringing together community rather than just having a report to show. And we felt that this particular report helped to bring together community, and the next step will be hoping to increase this community in the EU, having more dialogue across the Atlantic, for example, towards America and Harvard, where I was in a symposium just last week, where there's a nascent realization that also North America needs to do something with it, linking also with Canada. So really kind of hoping to work together with the partners over the upcoming couple of years to not only write reports, but really bring together community, have these dialogues, convene, and that way bring the debate forward, help to bring the debate forward as well.
Wonderful. No time to be bored then. Thanks very much, Marianne. I'll let you get back to the careful examination of the Circular Economy Action Plan that was just published this morning.
Likewise.
All right, speak very soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. That's it for us on this very important topic. I'm sure you'll have a lot of other thoughts to feed back to us, and stay tuned for more live events from Chaos Today. Thank